Welcome back to the Broadman Word, and we are continuing on with not just our walkthrough of Philippians or how we should think as believers, but specifically how we should think about the concept and the characteristic of humility. So, earlier this week we looked at humility seen in the example of Christ. Today we will see humility through the examples of Paul, Timothy, and Epaphroditus. So, turn back to Philippians chapter 2 with me. We're going to start at verse 12 today, though. So, Philippians chapter 2, verse 12. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So, first off, the phrase at the end of verse 12, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, that idea is not work out for your own salvation. It's work out your own salvation. So, does this mean work for your own salvation or work out? Obviously, I mean the words say it's work out. So, but what are we trying to get at? Is it this idea that we live in a works-based faith, that in order to get to heaven we have to do a certain amount of things to get there? Or do we live in, as believers in Jesus, do we live in a faith that is based off of, is by grace through faith? However, then we show that we are believers based on the things that we do afterwards, and we strive to become more and more like Jesus. That idea that we strive to become more and more like Christ after Jesus saves us from our sin, that idea is called sanctification. So what does it mean to be sanctified? To be sanctified is to be set apart. And the only way that we can be sanctified is in order to be justified. And justified is basically, it's a legal term, but it's like justify and never sinned. And well, we'll never get to that point in our lives, but Jesus and his sacrifice allows us to be justified and thus be sanctified and then eventually be glorified. And glorified is the idea that once you and I either die on this earth or Jesus comes back and takes us home, that is our glorification, that we spend eternity with him in resurrection bodies, and there will be no more sadness, no more pain, no more death anymore. That is the glorification that is to come. So right now, as human beings, we're in this justification, sanctification era where once you become a believer of Jesus, now that you are justified. And so now you are working that out through sanctification. Not working for your salvation, but working out your salvation. And that is what, again, is called sanctification. So Paul is asking here that to work out your sanctification, not because he's talking to the Philippians, not because, don't work out your sanctification when your pastor is there. Don't work out your sanctification when your parents are watching or when your friends are watching. You should be working out your sanctification all the time. And when it says fear and trembling, it's interesting, this concept. So fear, we think about, oh no, it's something really scary. Like for me, I hate horror movies. So for me, I would be very fearful during those movies, but it's a different kind of fear. It's a reverential fear. Now, trembling, that can be two things. Either one is a response to something that is incredibly exciting and joyful, or it is a response to something that is very scary. And so trembling, I think, here refers to the reverential fear that we experience when we are talking about the Lord, when we are in His presence. I think that's what is, yeah, that is what we are talking about. And then, of course, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for His good pleasure. And to me, that's the most encouraging thing about the Christian life, is that even the good things I do, I'm not really, yes, I do them literally, but it is only through Christ and the Holy Spirit and His guidance that I'm even thinking about those things. It doesn't mean that somebody who's an unbeliever is 100%, like they're 100% thinking evil thoughts all the time. It's not like an unbeliever will never have a good thought at all, or they'll never do a good thing at all, but they won't have the godly motives behind those thoughts, words, and actions. Whereas believers, we should have them. Now, that doesn't mean that every believer, when they do something, say something, or think something, that they have godly, godly, godly influence behind it. Many believers will do things, say things, and think things that are good, except they have personal selfish motives behind them. So it's a good reminder overall in verses 12 and 13. That's just those two verses. So let's continue to see. Do all things without grumbling or disputing in verse 14, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or work in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad to rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. So here is the Apostle Paul's example of humility. Now, obviously, he can give a lot more examples, and we see that in his life, whether it is his willingness to be imprisoned, or to be beaten, or eventually to be martyred. All of those are definitely examples of humility. But here, he's talking about pouring himself out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith. So what does that refer to? So being poured out as a drink offering is the idea that you are, in the Old Testament, that you would actually pour out the first fruits of your grape wine, like grape harvest, and you would pour those on the sacrifice before the Lord to show the first fruits of your work, as well as your sacrifice for your sin. That's kind of the idea behind it there in the Old Testament. And so here, he's being poured out as a drink offering, to give the idea that, look, I'm giving my all. The Apostle Paul, I've given my all to encourage you in the faith, and that's kind of what I'm seeing in verse 17 there. So with that being said, I think that's an incredibly important thing to hold on to and to remember. And not only that, but it's something that he's happy to do. And he's rejoicing over the fact that he gets to put his wants, his desires on hold for the cause of the gospel, and then also to encourage and to prop up the other believers that are around him and in his life. So with that being said, we could keep going with Timothy and Epaphroditus. However, I do want to give both of them and their examples the time. So we're actually just going to cut this short here with just the Apostle Paul's example of humility, which is, humility is a way to work out your salvation. Again, not work for, but work out your salvation. Being sanctified, being set apart, is a very humbling thing. And the Apostle Paul has showed us that today. So next week we will get to Timothy and Epaphroditus as we continue on. Thanks.